It was meant to be a gesture of goodwill. A high-level Chinese delegation visiting Buckingham Palace. Photos, formality, and the kind of ceremonial hospitality the world expects from Britain's oldest traditions. But just as they passed one of the palace guards, one of the silent men in red, standing motionless in the heat, a comment was made, a private insult, spoken in Mandarin. The delegate assumed no one understood. He was wrong, because the guard he mocked wasn't just standing for show. He understood everything. And what he said next, softly, fluently, and with the weight of history behind him, left the entire room in stunned silence. So who was this silent soldier? And what did he reveal that changed the tone of the entire diplomatic event? Now, before we reveal the full story, first, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. The clouds parted just long enough to let the late morning sun glance off the gates of Buckingham Palace. The brass finials gleamed against the stone, and the red coats of the Queen's Guard stood vivid as ever, motionless against a world that never stopped moving. Warrant Officer Tobias Hart didn't blink. He stood at ceremonial attention on the right flank of the palace forecourt, boots planted firm on the cobblestone. The Coldstream Guard's scarlet tunic clung tightly to his frame, crisp white belt fastened across his chest, and bearskin cap rising like a sentinel's crown. He could see in the corner of his vision the preparations unfolding across the royal courtyard. Tables set, protocol officers checking earpieces, foreign aides murmuring in Mandarin and English. Today's event wasn't for the public. There would be no changing of the guard, no sea of tourists pressing phones against the railings. This was quiet ceremony, a private reception for a visiting Chinese military and diplomatic delegation arranged after months of negotiation behind closed doors. It was meant to be symbolic, a show of mutual respect. The Chinese officials were here to tour the Royal Gallery, meet with UK defence liaisons, and view certain regimental traditions meant to demonstrate British hospitality without compromising protocol. Flags had been paired at the forecourt arch. Silverware had been polished to reflection. Every step had been choreographed down to the minute. But Tobias had seen enough diplomacy in his life to know that beneath every bow was a measure, every smile hid a calculation, and every still moment, especially one like this, was an invitation for someone to test its limits. Through the far archway, a line of sleek black cars emerged, each one flying the gold-starred red flag of the People's Republic. Palace staff straightened. Officers checked watches. The footmen moved like clock hands. Tobias didn't move. As the doors opened and figures in tailored suits and dark military dress began stepping out, the tension rose like heat off the courtyard stone. General secretaries, foreign security attachés, a deputy defence minister, and in the centre of them all, Colonel Sun Jian, flanked by 2 aides and carrying himself like someone accustomed to deference. They were greeted at the forecourt by the UK's Assistant Under-Secretary for Defence Engagements and a ceremonial attaché. Smiles were exchanged, photographs taken for internal media. Tobias's eyes stayed forward, fixed somewhere in the middle distance, but he was listening. Always listening. As the delegation was ushered into the Queen's Gallery for their private tour, Tobias returned to full stillness. But something had shifted. There was an energy in the air, subtle but unmistakable, the kind that precedes tension or revelation. He had stood for kings and queens. He had stood for silence. Today, he would stand again. But not for mockery. The Queen's Gallery was bathed in soft white light, the kind that made even old oil paintings feel alive. Walls lined with portraits of monarchs, war heroes and distant empires watched silently as the delegation moved through the space. A museum-grade hush filled the hall, broken only by murmured translations and the clack of polished shoes on marble. Tobias Hart remained stationed just outside the gallery entrance, visible through the open archway, an extension of the architecture itself, carved in discipline and silence. From that distance, he could hear everything. The British attaché explained the significance of each displayed item. A sabre, presented after the Boxer Rebellion. Medals from joint World War operations. A photo of Chinese and British troops standing together in Korea. It was carefully selected curation. Reminders that the two nations, however ideologically distant, shared a complex military history. But some guests were harder to impress than others. Colonel Sun Jian, broad-shouldered and sharp-featured, walked a half-step ahead of his group, arms clasped behind his back. His voice carried easily as though he had no intention of keeping anything private. At one display, an oil painting of Coldstream Guards at Waterloo, he leaned slightly toward a younger delegate beside him and said in Mandarin, "Theatrical, isn't it? They dress their soldiers like toy dolls and call it tradition. Red coats, tall hats, actors in a national play." The aide gave a low chuckle, not realizing the sound, carried across the marble like a dropped coin. Another voice responded softly, "Their uniforms haven't changed in centuries. Symbolism is a form of pride, I suppose." Colonel Sun smiled in the way certain men do when they're certain no one around them understands. "Symbolism is cheap when it replaces utility," he said, still in Mandarin. "These men are decorative. For tourists, wax statues with rifles. Their usefulness ended when Britain's empire did." Several British officials smiled awkwardly, oblivious to the content but sensing the tone. One interpreter hesitated, as if deciding whether or not to translate. He chose not to. Inside the gallery, the atmosphere remained diplomatic, but just outside, Tobias heard every word. He didn't twitch, didn't blink, but his jaw tensed just enough that the skin beneath his collar shifted. Mandarin had been drilled into him for years, first out of necessity, later out of respect. He could recite Chinese field codes better than some PLA recruits. He had worn desert camouflage beside men like the ones now being mocked, and 2 of those men had never made it back. Colonel Sun took one last glance toward the doorway, toward Tobias, and smirked. "Like a wax figure," he said again, this time gesturing. "Still, unaware, not even worth photographing." Another aide laughed softly. A British curator, trying to maintain momentum, invited the group toward the next section, a quieter room displaying ceremonial uniforms and medals. But something had changed. The air felt subtly off-kilter, like a note played just slightly flat. Inside the stillness, Tobias inhaled slowly through his nose. One breath, then another. Protocol demanded silence. Discipline required composure, but respect demanded something else entirely. The hush inside the Queen's gallery remained intact as the delegation filtered into the adjoining ceremonial chamber. Glass cases lined the walls, displaying medals from Queen Victoria's campaigns, buttons from the Napoleonic era, and full-dress Coldstream Guard uniforms preserved behind polished panels. Colonel Sun made a brief show of politeness, nodding as the British guide explained the significance of each item. But behind his eyes was a private joke that no one else could hear, at least no one he thought could. The Lord Chamberlain stood near the rear, posture stiff but diplomatic, watching the interaction unfold with a careful neutrality. These visits were meant to foster goodwill. Friction was bad optics. Offence, even veiled, was something to be buried under smiles and protocol. But outside the ceremonial hall at the archway entrance, the stone figure in red finally moved. Tobias Hart took a single step forward. It was nothing dramatic, just one step off his post, right boot meeting marble with deliberate precision. But the sound echoed louder than a shout. Everyone turned. Even the Chinese delegation froze, their eyes drawn to the impossible, a Queen's Guard in motion without command during a foreign visit. The Lord Chamberlain's voice rang sharply. "Warrant Officer Hart, stand down!" Tobias didn't flinch, didn't answer. Instead, he reached up, slowly, deliberately, and removed his bearskin cap, lowering it with care until it rested tucked beneath his left arm. His face was fully visible now, square jaw, short dark hair damp with heat, eyes like slate, polished with time. Silence spread through the room, like ink in water. Then Tobias spoke. "Colonel Sun," he said in perfect Mandarin, clear and measured, the tonal precision of a native speaker honed over years of use. "I believe I heard you refer to the Coldstream Guards as decorative actors." The translator didn't move. He wasn't needed. The Chinese delegation stared in stunned disbelief. The British officials, most of them unable to understand the words, sensed something serious was unfolding, but hadn't caught up yet. Tobias stepped forward again, crossing the threshold into the gallery proper. Not fast, not aggressive, just intentional. "You assumed, as many do, that because we are silent, we are ignorant, that because we do not speak, we do not understand." He turned slightly, addressing the wider room now. "That mistake has been made before, on tarmacs, in war zones, in embassies, and now, here." Colonel Sun's expression shifted, confidence replaced with the first trace of something brittle. The smug curve of his lips collapsed into a rigid line. "I was there," Tobias continued, "in Sichuan, 2015. Earthquake zone, landslide rescue, operation name classified. Partnered with PLA Rapid Response Infantry. 8 British advisors, 1 translator." Now the silence became reverent. People no longer shuffled. No one breathed too loud. "2 of your men died pulling civilians out of a collapsed dormitory. One handed me a girl with a broken femur and said, 'Take her, I'll come after.' He never did." Tobias let the weight of the memory settle in the air before continuing. "They were not actors, and neither are we." The air inside the Queen's gallery had gone still, not polite or expectant, but hollow, like a room bracing for aftershock. Colonel Sun stood rooted to the spot, his arms no longer clasped behind his back, but stiff at his sides. His lips parted as if to respond, but Tobias Hart's voice moved ahead of him, calm, unwavering, and still in Mandarin. "I was embedded with your unit's second column, 3 days without sleep. We carried children on our backs down 6 kilometers of broken mountain switchbacks. Do you remember what that terrain looked like, Colonel? You may have seen it from an air-conditioned vehicle. I saw it under my boots." A few heads turned sharply. British officers and diplomatic staff, suddenly realizing the nature of what was unfolding. A ceremonial guard was speaking in Mandarin, fluently, and addressing a foreign military dignitary with first-hand detail from a classified mission. "One of your men, Sergeant Tao, gave me his own jacket to wrap around a hypothermic woman. He handed over his satellite phone to let a survivor call her family. He died that night in a rock slide, still searching the hillside." Tobias's tone never wavered. There was no anger in it, only recollection. At his memorial service, a British field surgeon stood next to a Chinese general and said, "There are uniforms, and then there is the man inside them. I never forgot that." Colonel Sun tried again, this time in English. "How did you—" Tobias cut him off, smoothly switching to English mid-sentence, his cadence unchanged. "You thought no one here would understand what you said. That tradition makes us soft. That silence is weakness." He turned slightly to face the rest of the Chinese delegation now, eyes locked on them, not in accusation, but in dignity. "You mistook our restraint for ignorance, but restraint is how we choose to wield strength." A young attaché, barely out of training, dropped his eyes to the floor. The interpreter looked visibly shaken. Even the British Lord Chamberlain, no stranger to ceremonial mishaps, had no protocol for this. "This uniform is not theatre," Tobias said, voice firm. "It is memory of those who stood before us, those we stood beside, and those we buried." He looked back at Colonel Sun one final time. "I carry the names of 2 PLA soldiers in the lining of my service coat, handwritten because they earned that space beside my own." Nobody moved, not the aides, not the gallery staff, not even the senior UK officials frozen beside their Chinese counterparts. It wasn't just a breach of protocol anymore. It had become something else entirely, something sacred, something personal, something unplanned but unforgettable. "I did not speak to shame you," Tobias said quietly, the Mandarin returning like a prayer. "But I will never let silence be mistaken for absence or for permission." Colonel Sun stared at him, no longer defiant, but lost in the weight of what had just unfolded. And then came the voice no one expected. Operation Fire River. That was the code name. An older man stepped forward from the rear of the Chinese delegation, silver-haired, composed and wearing a dark military tunic, with medals that hadn't been issued in over a decade. General Liu. He spoke in Mandarin, softly but with absolute clarity. "I was commanding officer of the forward rescue perimeter in Sichuan. The British sent one liaison. We were told his Mandarin was fluent. We didn't know his name." He looked directly at Tobias now. "But I remember that someone refused to leave the women and children behind, even after our unit pulled back." He turned to Colonel Sun and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "That man is the one you insulted. Apologize." For a full 5 seconds after General Liu's command, the room didn't breathe. Colonel Sun's mouth opened, but no words came. His jaw worked, struggling for the kind of response he was trained to give, diplomatic, salvaging, face-saving, but none of the usual strategies applied. He had not just misstepped, he had dishonoured 2 nations in one breath. "You heard me," General Liu said again, this time more softly. "Apologise." The Lord Chamberlain, standing a few feet away, glanced at a British aide who looked equally stunned. This was no longer an awkward moment. It was now an international one, the kind that lived in whispers and transcripts long after the event ended. Colonel Sun gave a shallow bow, not to Tobias, not at first, but to General Liu. Then, stiffly, he turned toward the man in scarlet and white. I did not know who you were," he said in Mandarin. "I misspoke. My comments were in poor taste and not representative of my delegation." Tobias didn't move, didn't nod, didn't offer absolution. He simply stood, cap still tucked under his arm, posture perfect. His silence now held a new meaning, not the ceremonial kind, but the kind born from dignity reclaimed. Behind him, the Lord Chamberlain finally spoke. "Warrant Officer Hart, return to your post." But his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. It wasn't a command anymore, it was a release. Tobias turned, eyes passing briefly over the gallery crowd, British and Chinese alike, then gave a crisp, controlled nod and stepped back toward the threshold. As he walked, General Liu addressed the room once more. "There are men who serve tradition," he said quietly, "and men who become its stewards. We must know the difference. This man," he gestured toward Tobias, "did more to uphold shared honour than all our scripted courtesies today." The words carried more weight than any briefing ever could. Even those who didn't understand Mandarin felt the gravity in the general's voice. A British defence liaison stepped forward as if to close the moment, but stopped. Instead, he glanced toward the Lord Chamberlain, who gave the slightest shake of his head. No summary, no clean-up, just silence. And then, like the closing of a chapter, the Chamberlain nodded toward a nearby steward. "Let's allow our guests a moment. A brief recess." People began to disperse in quiet pairs. No one checked their phones. No one resumed their conversations. General Liu lingered for a second longer, then turned to Tobias as he neared the gallery threshold. "For what it's worth," he said now in English, "I remember Sergeant Tao." "And what you did?" Tobias offered a barely perceptible nod. "I carry his name," he replied softly. "We both do." As the general rejoined his delegation, Colonel Sun followed several steps behind. His earlier confidence dissolved into something humbler. The younger attachés didn't make eye contact as they filed out. Even the British officers had changed. Their expressions no longer held mere ceremonial detachment. Now there was a quiet recognition of something real, something unstageable that had just unfolded before them. And through it all, Tobias returned to his position at the gallery threshold, back to stillness. But now the silence had learned to listen. The Queen's gallery remained unnaturally still long after the last footstep of the Chinese delegation faded down the hallway. Inside, staff moved with the kind of quiet that follows a storm. Not scrambling, not relaxing, just absorbing, as if the air itself hadn't yet decided whether to resume breathing. Tobias Hart stood once more at his post, now just outside the grand entry arch. Bearskin cap returned to his head, white gloves resting lightly against the seams of his trousers. The same uniform, the same posture, but nothing about the moment was the same. A young royal aide, barely in his 20s, approached cautiously from the side. He didn't speak at first, just looked at Tobias with something between awe and disbelief. Then, in a whisper meant only for the man in red, "They're still stunned inside, the entire room. No one said a word." Tobias didn't shift his gaze, but replied softly, in English this time, "Some truths don't need volume, just clarity." The aide hesitated, then nodded and stepped back. A light breeze moved through the forecourt. The Union Jack stirred slightly above the archway. Somewhere deep in the palace, a clock chimed the hour. An ordinary sound returned to an extraordinary place. Inside the gallery, General Liu lingered alone for a moment longer. His aides had moved on, but he had remained behind, looking at the oil painting of British guards at Waterloo that had started this whole exchange. He gave the canvas one final glance, then turned and walked out silently. As he passed Tobias, he paused just long enough to meet his eyes. "We were wrong to assume silence meant absence." Tobias didn't reply. He didn't need to. Colonel Sun, walking at the rear of the group now, kept his head slightly bowed. His swagger was gone, replaced with the bearing of a man who had not been reprimanded, but revealed. For a few seconds, even the footsteps of the delegation seemed quieter, like they'd become aware of the floor beneath them in a way they hadn't before. No one smiled, no one posed for photos. There were no handshakes, no final group shots. Just a quiet, measured walk to the waiting cars. Doors opened, diplomats stepped in, engines started. As the last car eased past the palace gate and disappeared down the mall, Tobias remained where he was, still as ever. But this time, no one mistook that stillness for emptiness. Inside the gallery, the Lord Chamberlain removed his gloves and folded them with care. He turned to one of the stewards nearby. "Make sure the cameras didn't catch any of that," he said quietly. Then, after a long pause, "But God help me, I wish they had." The barracks behind Buckingham Palace always felt like a different world. Quieter, darker, stripped of ceremony. Stone corridors, the hum of old radiators, the soft clang of boots on worn floors. It was where the uniforms rested, and the men beneath them remembered how to breathe. Tobias Hart sat alone in the changing room, back straight, cap placed neatly on the bench beside him. His jacket hung open now, white gloves set atop his folded belt. The fluorescent light above him buzzed faintly, unnoticed. He hadn't spoken since returning. No debrief, no explanation. Just the silent routine of undressing, piece by piece, the same way he'd done every shift before. A knock on the door broke the stillness. Sergeant Jamie Collins entered, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, bearing 2 cups of tea. He held one out without ceremony. "Thought you could use something warm." Tobias accepted it with a nod. They sat in silence for a while, the steam curling between them like smoke from a distant fire. Collins finally broke it. "So, Mandarin, huh?" Tobias didn't smile. "Had to learn it. Didn't think I'd need it here." I heard bits of it made it back to the Lord Chamberlain. Said it was the most dignified insubordination he's ever seen. Tobias took a sip. I didn't step out to be dignified. Collins nodded. Number, you stepped out because someone crossed a line. Another silence settled. This one easier. Then, without looking up, Tobias reached into the small locker beside him. From behind a folded towel, he pulled out a worn, laminated envelope. Inside, 2 slips of paper, creased but preserved. Chinese characters scrawled in black ink. Names. He stared at them for a long moment, lips barely moving as he read the characters aloud under his breath. Collins didn't ask. He didn't need to. Tobias returned the slips to their place and closed the locker softly. I carry them, he said, voice low, just in case someone forgets. They won't now, Collins replied. Outside, the guards were preparing for the next rotation. Life would resume. The tourists would return. The protocol would reassert itself. But somewhere beneath it all, today had changed something. What would you have done if you heard an insult that no one else understood? Do you think ceremonial silence should ever be broken to defend what matters? And does tradition mean less or more when the world forgets what built it? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one, and your thoughts help shape these stories. If this moment of quiet strength moved you, give this video a like. It genuinely helps. Subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss tomorrow's Royal Guard story. We upload daily, and if you know someone who thinks ceremony is just costume and pageantry, share this with them. They might realize there's more behind the uniform than they ever imagined. You should see more of our stories on your screen right now. Click one and dive into another side of these incredible soldiers. We'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place.